Growing up, Friday the 13th movies were some of my favorite. What about you? Put in the comments as to what your favorite horror movie is. So in this tutorial, we're going to make a Jason mask. Head over to your local spooky store. I went to Spirit and I picked up one of these hockey masks, but we can make this so much better. To start off, you're going to want to sand it. You need a nice surface for any of the paint you're going to use to go and grip it. I ended up using mainly matte paints for this, and the brand that I use for a lot of these paints is the Plaid paint brand. Sanding it is only going to take you a couple of minutes. There will be some residue that is left behind, so make sure to do this in a well-ventilated area and have a vacuum near you. Now, after you have it sanded, wipe off any extra little bits of plastic, and we're going to start to draw on these extra dots. I have a Dremel that's next to me as well. I'll be using that just to get a bit of a point into all of these dots after I'm done drawing them, and have a reference up that'll help you so much when you're figuring out where all of these are going to go. I tried making this as accurate as I could to some of the different movies, but of course it's a little bit different. So this Dremel I'm using just to poke this small little hole in here, and this type of material or this type of plastic is really bendy, and I was able to use a knife after to get in there and make these pretty perfectly shaped circles. If you end up using the same technique that I am using, just make sure your hand is away from the tip of the knife. You do have to use a bit of pressure to really get that in there and also twist. As you're also doing this too, you can see there's a lot of plastic mess that is made. What I ended up doing is I cut out all the holes and I just vacuumed everything up until I moved on to the next portion of this. The next portion of this after I had all the holes out was I used my Dremel just to clean them up slightly and to get off any extra little pieces that were kind of poking there. Then I moved on to a quick sand. I got both sides, both the front along with also the back, because keep in mind you don't want any of those little extra plastic pieces because they are pretty sharp, and I found that out quickly. You don't want those little extra plastic pieces to poke you because this is a pretty tight fitting mask, and if you're going to take it on and off, then you want to be safe. The different colors that I used for this are over at the side here, so I used a little bit of that kind of almost peach color, some yellow, along with also a bit of white. This gave the mask a great aged look. To keep the paint even, I decided that using a sponge brush was probably the best method of doing this. You could use a normal paintbrush, but if you use a normal paintbrush, you might get different clumped up areas and you're going to get some of those streaks there. Take your time with this layer. You don't want to fully and totally rush it. You want a nice, even paint on this, and this is going to make it look pretty aged and also really interesting. Now I'm mixing up a bit of this black paint here too, and I'm very lightly brushing this on here. This is a technique of, we'll say along the lines of dry brushing, except I'm using the sponge, so I'm not distributing too much of this paint on there. But I'm going along with the shape of the mask, and I'm adding some of this gray to make some different shadowed areas where, you know, you would kind of have some aging from weathering or whatever the case is, kind of that you can see on the normal mask anyway. At this edge here, I am using these pair of kitchen scissors to cut a small piece of plastic out. You don't have to do this, I just felt that it added so much more to this entire mask, especially because I used fake blood after it was cut out. If you're going to do this, leave this slightly jagged, but make sure you do sand down any extra areas or cover it with paint to take off some of that extra little bit of an edge. I'm using some black here to give it some shadow. And after I added some of that shadow there, then I sketched out the different triangle shaped areas, the one that is between the two eye holes, along with also the elongated ones that are underneath where the nose and eyes are. I found for this part that having a reference was one of the best things that I could have done. It made it a lot easier to follow along exactly where I wanted to put these and where these should have gone to make it just a bit more accurate to the mask. Now, yes, of course, this mask doesn't fully and totally look like all of the different variations, but I wanted to at least make some of these different marks look more like they would in the movies. Now I'm painting this with some red. Again, I'm using some matte paint for this. I feel that the matte paint just made it look more aged, more weathered. So you could always use some gloss. It just depends on what you want to do. I did use a slight gloss finish of some Mod Podge at the end, which when we get to that point, you will see so. But the under matte paint still made it look pretty weathered. The layer for the gloss was just to protect everything at the end. Now after that has been painted, and you do want to wait for this to dry because if it smudges, it's just not going to look as movie-like. Then I went over to the eyes and I added a bit of this black paint here. I also made it look like there was some cracking that was at the edges. I felt like this added just a bit more to the mask. Then I decided that after I put these little lines on, which I did blend with a bit more of paint afterwards, that I wanted to go back in with a knife and scrape up that area. Just a bit, make it look a bit more aged, weathered, maybe like it's been through some stuff, something along those lines. I felt like it really added to everything. Then I also took this knife and very lightly glided it across a couple of different areas, because even in the movies, there are some different marks that are on the mask from different events that Jason gets himself into. So after I did that, I followed along with a bit of gray to make it pop, and with using the knife, it did add a bit of texture here and some dimension. Now I'm dry brushing on a bit of black to just give some of these different streaks here, make it look slightly more aged. After everything had dried, onto the slight gloss, but I didn't use too much. I only used just enough to protect the surface of the paint, so if I accidentally bump against anything, it's not going to go and flake off, pull off, or any of that jazz. I did end up using some Mod Podge for this, and again, it gave it just a very slight gloss finish, but because the paint underneath it was matte and there was already texture, it still looks pretty matte. After that had dried, onto some fake blood. I'm using some alcohol activated fake blood for this. That's going to stick really, really, really well to this mask. It's not going to rub off too easily, and if I ever wanted to remove it, I easily could. So while I was putting this on, I used my sponge tool again, and I found that doing this added some texture for the fake blood above to really stick. I also did let this drip slightly. I hung this up for a while, let everything dry fully and totally, and let it drip, and it looked pretty cool after everything was done. Then I splattered just a bit more of this onto the mask, waited for that layer to dry, and I decided that I was going to put just a bit of that onto my fingers too, add a couple of fingerprints, might as well add a little bit more to the mask. And here's how my mask turned out. I love that it still has that weathered look to it, even though it has that slight bit of gloss to the top. Thank you all so much for watching. Make sure to comment your favorite horror movie below. I will see you again tomorrow, and this is the start of 31 days of Halloween makeup and Halloween tutorials. Happy spooky season! See you later! Bye!